The sound hit first, metal against concrete. The sharp, hollow clang of a feed bucket placed deliberately on a floor that had absorbed 1,000 similar sounds before it. 0600 hours at Fort Bragg's K9 Bravo Rehabilitation Center, and the fluorescent lights had been buzzing for the past 47 minutes, casting their unforgiving white light over 2 rows of steel kennels, 14 dogs, and one woman who had absolutely no business being there. Commander Ethan Cole heard it before he opened the door. He paused with his hand on the latch. 4 officers arranged behind him in loose formation, Lieutenant Flynn Estes to his right, holding a tablet, Sergeant Ronan Briggs at the rear with the squared-off jaw of someone who'd already decided this would be quick, Captain Iris Brennan's footsteps clicking precise on the gravel behind them, and Dr. Carter Greer, the base's senior K9 specialist, already scrolling through something on his screen as if the morning's conclusion was already written. Cole had been on base for 11 minutes. He had not had coffee. He did not need it. 16 years in naval special warfare had long since rewired his body to run on something older and harder than caffeine. He pushed the door open. The facility smelled the way it always did, antiseptic, layered over dog food, layered over the particular living warmth of 14 animals in an enclosed space, each one of them trained for environments that defied every category of normal. The kennels ran the length of both walls. Steel mesh, rubber matting, individual water systems, each unit built for a dog that had been somewhere no civilian dog ever went, done things no civilian animal was asked to do. Cole's eyes moved through the room the way they always moved. Left wall, right wall, neutral center, down. At the far end of the room, a woman was crouching beside the last kennel in the row, spooning food from a large steel bucket into a metal bowl, with the focus of someone who had done this enough times that it had become not routine exactly, but settled. Her work uniform was the standard-issue blue-gray of base maintenance contractors, faded at the elbows, a small bleach mark near the left hip pocket, hair pulled back low, face turned away, not large, not loud, in every visible way, exactly the kind of person a room full of important people looked past without registering. Cole did not look past her. Who authorized this? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Silence from his team, because none of them knew. Cole moved 3 steps forward into the room. Around him, the 14 dogs were doing what they typically did at feeding time, pacing, nosing the kennel mesh, the low percussion of paws on rubber matting, all except 4. Those 4 were not watching the food. They were watching the woman. "Excuse me?" Cole's voice carried the particular flatness of a man who'd spent 16 years having people respond to him immediately. "This is a restricted facility. I need your name and authorization level." The woman set the bowl down. She didn't stand immediately. She moved the bowl 2 inches to the left, adjusting its angle relative to the kennel door with the deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what position a dog preferred to approach from. And then she rose. She turned. Her face was the kind of face that made you look twice without being able to say why. Narrow jaw, eyes the particular gray-green of shallow, coastal water, moving across Cole's face with an unhurried, thorough assessment that he had learned over 16 years to associate with exactly one category of person. "Jade," she said, "civilian volunteer." Cole looked at her. Then he turned to Estes. "Get me the volunteer roster." Estes was already on his tablet. Sergeant Ronan Briggs stepped forward, 6'2", 210 pounds, the confident posture of an MP who had handled plenty of unauthorized personnel situations and already considered this one resolved. He moved to the woman's side and placed his hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with me." What happened next was not dramatic. That was, later, what everyone would find most difficult to explain. Every single dog in the room moved, not lunging, not barking, not rattling their kennel doors in warning. 14 animals moved with the synchronized precision of a single organism responding to a single signal. The dogs in the kennels rose and pressed forward to stand at alert, oriented as one toward the woman, every pair of eyes fixed on Briggs's hand. The 4 in the open exercise area did something else entirely. They formed a circle, a clean, tight, geometrically deliberate ring around the woman, shoulders lowered, heads level, facing outward in a complete perimeter. Not frantic, not disordered, The low group growl that filled the room was controlled, textured, the sound of animals that had made a collective decision and were communicating it without ambiguity. Briggs's hand stopped. He stopped because in the half-second before contact he felt the atmospheric shift that every soldier learns to read before they learn its name. The pressure drop that comes before something irreversible, not the event itself, what precedes it. He looked down at the four dogs, then up at Cole. Cole had not moved. Platz. He used the German command cleanly, with the correct inflection, the standard down command for attack-trained military working dogs. He'd used that word in 3 different countries. Not one of the 14 dogs responded. He said it again, louder. The circle held. The growl continued. Delta, the lead Malinois, the one with the distinctive red marking on his left ear that Greer had flagged twice in behavioral reports for what he diplomatically called independent decision-making patterns, turned his head and looked directly at Cole with an expression that communicated something Cole could not quite categorize. "Let me handle this." Carter Greer moved past Estes, tablet still in hand, his voice carrying the particular edge of a professional defending his domain. He had 14 years in K9 behavioral science, 3 published papers on military working dog conditioning. He did not appreciate the implication that his animals were operating outside parameters he had approved. He worked through the full standard command sequence. English, German, Dutch, the 2 hand signals used in JSOC operational environments, the short whistle pattern for recall. His voice stayed measured. His credentials were impeccable. The circle did not move. Greer's jaw tightened, and then the woman said quietly, without looking at any of them, "Easy." Not a command, not directed. The word came out the way you'd say it to yourself when something needed to come down from a high place. A reflex, almost. A small calibration. 14 dogs sat simultaneously. The growling stopped. The formation held. Every animal still positioned around the woman, still facing outward. But the tension dissolved from their bodies all at once. From defensive to alert. From warning to waiting. The shift was so sudden and complete that Flynn Estes took an involuntary step backward before he caught himself. Cole's hands, hanging at his sides, had closed into fists. Greer turned to face the woman with professional outrage assembling itself into something specific. "That is not a recognized command sequence." "I didn't use one," she said, and went back to the feeding. Greer turned to Cole, his mouth opened, closed, because there was nothing technically wrong with what he was about to say, but saying it would mean acknowledging, in front of a commander, something he was not prepared to acknowledge. In the far corner of the room, Sergeant Caleb Vega had been sitting since before any of them arrived. 34 years old, 3 tours, Purple Heart, prosthetic left leg from the knee down, and the particular stillness in his eyes of someone for whom action and patience had become the same thing. He had a tablet in his lap that he hadn't looked at in 20 minutes. His right hand rested on the head of a Belgian Malinois. Ranger, 68 pounds, 4 years old, a veteran of Helmand Province who had not eaten reliably or tolerated physical contact from any handler since returning from deployment, until 3 weeks ago. Vega watched the circle of dogs settle around the woman. His expression was not surprised. It was something older than surprise. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who underestimated you, stay right here. Because what's about to unfold inside this facility is going to remind you exactly why silence is sometimes the deadliest weapon a person can carry. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. This is the kind of story you do not want to miss the ending of. And trust us on this, the ending will leave you completely speechless. Corporal Willow Shaw arrived 6 minutes into the standoff, clipboard in hand, with the expression of someone who'd been called in early to provide paperwork, and was rapidly understanding that the paperwork was not going to be the challenging part of her morning. 23 years old, 8 months on base. She'd transferred from motor pool administration and volunteered for the K9 program because her older brother had served 2 tours with a working dog unit, and she'd wanted, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, to understand what that meant. She stopped inside the door, took in the room, Cole's team, the seated formation of dogs, Vega in the corner, the woman in the maintenance uniform who was calmly continuing down the second row of kennels. Then Shaw did what she always did when she wanted to understand something. She looked at the details instead of the scene. She looked at the woman's left forearm. The scarring there was old, silver white against tan skin, running in the specific fragmented constellation that came from one particular kind of blast radius. Shaw's brother had described that pattern to her once, in a voice that meant he was describing something he'd rather leave where it was. IED fragmentation. The kind that happened when close proximity meant the casing was still hot when it arrived. Shaw said nothing, but she stopped watching the clipboard. Cole, meanwhile, was not finished. Last name, Hartwell. Jade Hartwell. Flat, filing it. Current employment, independent contractor, animal care. Who issued your access credential? Corporal Shaw's volunteer intake form. She didn't look up from the feeding. 3 weeks ago. I'm on the list. Cole looked at Estes. Estes looked at his tablet. She's on the list, sir. P.O. Box Fayetteville. No service record on file. No service record. Cole said it without inflection. He was watching her hands again, the way she positioned each bowl, not just setting it down, but placing it at a precise angle relative to the kennel door, then stepping back exactly 18 inches, giving the dog space to approach without feeling cornered. It was not an animal lover's instinct. It was a protocol, a specific protocol he had seen in exactly one context, and that context was not volunteer intake. He pushed the thought aside. Hartwell. He waited until she looked at him. I'm Commander Ethan Cole, Naval Special Warfare Command. This facility requires clearance you don't currently have on file. I'm asking you to leave voluntarily before this becomes a formal matter. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable. Not defiant, not anxious. Complete, the way a person holds a look when they've already made their assessment and don't need more information. With respect, Commander, she said, there are 8 dogs that haven't eaten yet. The room sat with that. Then Cole said quietly to Briggs, when she's finished, escort her out. Yes, sir. Briggs nodded. Flynn Estes moved Cole aside by half a step, voice dropped low. Sir, my read is press. ProPublica ran a piece on MWD retirement protocols 18 months ago. This could be someone building a follow-up. Blank civilian record, access through a volunteer form, specific knowledge of program details. It fits. Cole considered this. It was logical. It was also the kind of explanation that was so convenient, it made him suspicious. 16 years had taught him that the tidiest explanation was frequently wrong. He nodded anyway. Look into it. Captain Iris Brennan entered at 0632 with the purposeful energy of a senior officer whose morning schedule was already running behind. Folder under her arm, eyes scanning the room in the administrative assessment mode of someone whose job was to make everything conform to a form. She looked at the woman in the maintenance uniform. Who authorized an unsupervised civilian contractor in this space? Working on that, ma'am, Estes said. Brennan looked at Jade Hartwell the way she looked at administrative anomalies, as a problem to be corrected before it disrupted sequence. Cole, have your MP remover. Handled, ma'am, Cole said, though he was watching Hartwell's left hand close around an empty bowl, and noting that the motion, bowl lifted, bucket tilted, contents dispensed, bowl repositioned, was done with the unconscious economy of someone who had performed physical tasks in environments where wasted motion had consequences. Shaw had moved close enough to Vega's corner to ask quietly, how long has she been coming in? Vega's thumb moved in a slow stroke down Ranger's ear. Every morning, 0300. Shaw absorbed this. 0300. When I can't sleep, I come down around 0200. She's always here before me. Lights off, sitting on the floor. A pause. Ranger hadn't eaten in 4 days when she showed up. Shaw looked at Ranger, 71 pounds of carefully rebuilt trust, pressing his head into Vega's hand while his eyes tracked Jade Hartwell's movements with the quiet, meditative attention of an animal that has decided where its axis is. 3 weeks, Shaw said softly. Vega said nothing. He didn't need to. The feeding finished at 0644. Jade Hartwell set the empty bucket down, straightened, and turned to find Ronan Briggs positioned between her and the door. Professionally placed, arms loose, the body language of someone executing a task without escalating it. Briggs was good at his job. Ma'am, come with me, please. He reached for her elbow. Not a grab, the standard non-confrontational guide contact. And then Briggs experienced something he would think about for a long time afterward. He reached. His arm extended toward the angle of her left shoulder, and in the half second before contact, she moved. 1 step, angled 20 degrees left, weight dropping into her back hip as her shoulder cleared the line of his hand. not evasive in the obvious sense, not a fight response. The automatic physical vocabulary of a body trained to read and exit contact angles the way other people read sentences. Briggs's hand closed on empty space. He stood there. Briggs was, among other credentials, an 8-year judo practitioner. He had a refined sense of how bodies communicated their intention before they acted. The preparatory weight shift, the micro-adjustment of balance that preceded movement. What he had just felt was not the movement of an untrained person. He looked at her. She was already adjusting the feed bucket on its hook, apparently unaware of what had just occurred. Briggs looked at Cole. Cole had seen it. His expression had not changed, but the muscle beneath his jaw had tightened once and held. Cole crossed the room and stood in front of her, close enough for directness, far enough that it wasn't pressure. "Hartwell, I need you to walk out of this building, right now." She met his eyes. "With respect, sir, I don't think that's your best option." The room went very still. Cole's voice came out precise and level. "I beg your pardon? The animals." The mildness in her voice was not practiced. It was the real variety, the kind that comes from having been in conversations that were considerably more urgent than this one. They have a feeding and socialization window between 0600 and 0730. Disrupting that window elevates cortisol for the following 6 hours, which directly impacts their therapy effectiveness in the afternoon session. She paused. "You have a budget review to conduct. I'd recommend completing it without further disrupting the animals you're here to evaluate." Brennan made a sound that was not quite language. Flynn Estes had stopped typing. Carter Greer looked up from his terminal. "The cortisol window parameters you're citing are from a proprietary JSOC field research protocol," he said, with a quality in his voice that was approaching something he wouldn't want to call alarm. "That document is not in any public literature." She looked at him. "I know." And then she went to the wall beside Vega's corner and sat down, back straight, hands folded in her lap, waiting with the patience of someone who had waited in considerably more difficult places. The silence that followed was the kind that happens in a room after the expected door fails to open. Cole stared at her for a moment. Then he turned to Estes. Estes gave a small, controlled shake of his head. Nothing. Turned to Brennan. Brennan's eyes had shifted into the narrow configuration of someone revising her understanding of the situation. And Caleb Vega in his corner said quietly, "Ranger hasn't allowed physical contact from any personnel in 14 months. That's in his behavioral file." He looked at Jade Hartwell. "She's had her hand in his kennel every morning for 21 days. Greer moved to his workstation and opened his laptop with the focused intensity of a professional trying to find a technical explanation for something that was beginning to resist technical thinking. Cole stood in the middle of the room and did what he did when data was insufficient and time was pressing. He watched. 17 minutes passed. They passed in the way that minutes pass in rooms where everyone is still performing their assigned function while privately recalibrating what that function means. Greer's fingers worked at his keyboard. Estes ran parallel searches on his tablet. Brennan was on her phone in the hallway. Briggs stood near the door with the expression of a man trained to manage situations who was managing one he hadn't been trained for. Cole watched Jade Hartwell sit with the complete stillness of someone who had been in rooms like this before, rooms where a group of people were working to determine what to do with her. He watched Delta, the lead Malinois, who had shifted after feeding to sit approximately 3 feet from her left knee without touching her, without needing anything from her, just present in the specific way that working dogs orient around the person they have decided matters. He watched Ghost, the Dutch Shepherd from Mosul, the one Greer's reports listed as handler-dependent, elevated anxiety, not suitable for reassignment, cross the exercise area to lie down flush against her right hip. None of this was trained behavior. Cole had been around working dogs long enough to understand the difference. "Hartwell," he kept his voice flat and even, "you cited operational feeding protocols that exist in a classified field research document. Where did you access them?" She looked at him. "I read extensively. That information isn't published anywhere." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Cole let the air hold that for a moment. "Then, you know the operational histories of these animals. You stated Ghost's handler designation, Ranger's extraction circumstances, Delta's theater of operation." Her expression shifted just slightly, not defensively, but the way a face shifts when a conversation moves into territory it has been waiting for. "Yes, Ghost," Cole said. "Walk me through it." She didn't hesitate. Mosul, 2017, third deployment. Handler was Petty Officer First Class Rivera. He didn't come back. Ghost came home alone. He was considered for retirement within 6 months, but the behavioral assessments recommended continued service until the anxiety threshold made that impossible. The room was quiet in a way that had weight. Ranger, Cole said. Helmand Province, 2018. IED strike at 40 meters. Handler survived. Ranger was with him during the 6-hour wait for extraction. They were separated during the medevac. She looked at Vega, briefly. The handler was told Ranger was being processed for retirement. He wasn't given the opportunity to say goodbye. Vega's hand had gone still on Ranger's head. The dog pressed upward against the stillness, seeking the contact. Cole kept his voice neutral. Delta. She looked at the big Malinois. Delta looked back at her with the complete, unhurried attention of an animal that has made its alignment and sees no reason to revise it. Kandahar, she said. 2019. The word landed differently than the others. Cole was very still. That's all? For now, she said. Estes had stopped typing. Brennan had come back in from the hallway with her phone at her side and the particular stillness of a senior officer whose scheduled morning has encountered a variable she didn't plan for. Greer turned from his workstation, managing the careful distance between what he knew and what he was prepared to say. The level of operational detail you're demonstrating about these animals, their service histories, handler designations, theater assignments, that information requires active JSOC level clearance or above. He paused. You presented as a civilian volunteer. I am a civilian volunteer, she said. That's not what I'm asking. It's the accurate answer to what you asked. Greer turned to Cole with the expression of a man who has arrived at the edge of his professional framework and is looking at what's on the other side of it. Cole studied Jade Hartwell for a long, unbroken moment. Then, with the deliberateness of someone choosing a different approach, I'm going to ask you to remain in this facility for an extended period, Hartwell, not as a detainee, as a person of interest in an administrative review. I understand, she said. You're not giving me more right now. Not right now, she agreed. He turned to Estes. I want documentation on every individual who had recorded contact with all 14 of these animals across all 3 operational theaters. Cross-reference Helmand, Mosul, and Kandahar deployments, all K9 units, all handler designations, all support personnel at every classification level. Yes, sir. Estes was already moving, and in the corner Caleb Vega exhaled a breath that was barely audible, while Ranger lifted his head and pressed it firmly against the side of Vega's leg. Neither of them looked at the door. The temperature inside K9 Bravo had not changed. 68 degrees, year-round climate-controlled, and standard for the animals. But something else had shifted. The way pressure shifts in a sealed space when the balance of forces inside it changes. Greer had moved back to his terminal. His fingers had slowed. He was running the microchip registry for all 14 animals. Standard procedure, the kind of verification any competent specialist would perform when behavioral anomalies were flagged. Every military working dog carried a registered chip, manufacturer data, implant date, handler of record, service assignment chain. He entered Delta's number. Classified, clearance required. He frowned and entered Ghosts. Classified, a clearance required. He entered Rangers. Then he entered all 11 remaining numbers in rapid sequence. 14 identical lines. 14 animals whose entire service histories, chip data, handler assignments, deployment records, were sealed behind a clearance level that Carter Greer, 14-year veteran K9 specialist, base authority on military working dog behavioral science, did not hold. He turned in his chair slowly. Cole, he said. Cole came to the terminal and read the screen. He read all 14 lines. Then he straightened and looked across the room at Jade Hartwell, who was watching Delta with the same unguarded expression she'd worn briefly before, the one she put away when people were paying attention. These records are sealed at clearance level 6, Greer said. JSOC. I have never seen a military working dog registry entry sealed at that level in 14 years. Not once. He paused, choosing his next words. These animals don't officially exist in any system I can access. Cole said nothing. Brennan stepped up beside him, read the screen, and made her decision quickly. I'm calling NCIS. She stepped into the hallway without waiting for a response. Into the silence that followed, Flynn Estes looked up from his own terminal. His face held the specific quality of someone who has found something that was going to make things considerably more complicated. He looked at Cole. He looked at Jade Hartwell. Back at Cole. He tilted his phone so only Cole could see the screen. Navy Personnel Command, a search response. The body of the message was brief. The last line was not, "Contact Colonel Reynolds before proceeding." Cole read it. His eyes moved up. Jade Hartwell was not looking at him. She was looking at Delta. The big Malinois, who had spent the last 41 minutes as the quiet center of a protective formation that nobody in the room could technically explain, was looking back at her with the total, unhurried focus of an animal that had made its decision about where things stood and had no interest in reconsidering. Cole folded the phone back to Estes without speaking. The muscle beneath his jaw moved once, then held. Willow Shaw, against the back wall, was looking at the feed schedule on her clipboard without seeing it. She was thinking about the IED scarring. She was thinking about the way the woman had moved when Briggs reached for her. The weight drop, the angle clear, the complete absence of visible effort. She was thinking about 0300 hours, and lights off, and 14 dogs quiet in the dark. She was thinking about what her brother had told her once about the people who never talked about what they'd done, the ones who came back and worked somewhere quiet and didn't make noise and preferred it that way. "You'll recognize them," he'd said, "because they're the only ones who don't seem to need you to know." She looked at Jade Hartwell sitting against the wall with Delta at her knee, and Ghost pressed against her hip and Ranger watching from across the room, with the calm, fixed attention of an animal that had been lost and had found its axis again. Shaw looked down at her clipboard. 3 weeks ago on the volunteer intake form, the woman had printed her name in the careful block letters of someone who was accustomed to filling out forms that mattered. No military affiliation listed, no emergency contact. In the box labeled "Reason for Volunteering," she had written 4 words. "I know these dogs." Shaw read those 4 words for the first time. She looked up. She didn't say anything. But she took out her own phone and very quietly, without making a show of it, began looking up something she hadn't thought to look up before. In the center of the room, Cole had made a decision. "We're not proceeding with the budget review this morning," he said to Brennan, who had come back in from the hallway. "I need Reynolds here first." Brennan's expression moved through several things quickly. "Cole, the timeline adjusts." His voice carried the finality of someone who understood that a timeline built on incomplete information was not actually a timeline at all. "Call Reynolds. I just spoke with NCIS," Brennan said, and something in her voice had changed. Not much, but enough. "They confirmed Hartwell's file is locked at a clearance level this office doesn't have access to. Level 6. She stopped. "Ethan, that's not a civilian volunteer's file." The room absorbed this. Cole looked at Jade Hartwell for a long moment. She was not performing patience. She was not performing anything. She was simply sitting in the particular way that someone sits when they have been through enough, that the discomfort of a room full of people trying to figure out who you are registers as a minor inconvenience at most. Ghost had shifted his head to rest it on her knee. She had not reached down to acknowledge this, but her hand resting on the floor beside her hip had opened slightly, the fingers uncurling from their neutral position, the small, involuntary response of a body that was allowing itself for just a moment to be somewhere it recognized. "Delta," Cole said quietly, not as a command, as a name. The Malinois flicked an ear toward him. "Kandahar, 2019, Operation Phantom Storm." He watched her face. The name of the operation landed. Something moved in her expression. Not much, not enough for anyone who didn't know how to look, but Cole had spent 16 years reading the small movements that happened in faces when words found their target. She looked at him. "What do you know about that operation?" he said. She held his gaze. A long pause, the kind that isn't uncertainty, but choice. "I know," she said, "that 14 dogs and 8 operators went in, and that 7 operators came home." The room was completely still. "And I know," she said, "that Delta was the one who found the gap in the wall." Cole stared at her. He knew what she meant. He knew exactly what she meant because there were approximately 11 people alive who knew about the gap in the wall at the Kandahar compound in 2019, and he was one of them. And not one of those 11 people was standing in a maintenance uniform in a K9 rehabilitation facility at Fort Bragg claiming to be a civilian volunteer. He took a breath. He let it out. And then he said very carefully, to no one in particular, "Get me Reynolds. Now." You've seen the dogs refuse to move. You've seen Cole's certainty start to fracture. But here's the question that nobody in that room has thought to ask yet. Why do 14 highly trained military working dogs, animals that respond to one handler, all recognize this woman the same way? The answer is 3 minutes away. Don't go anywhere. And if this story is already hitting different for you, drop a comment below. We read every single one. The call to Colonel Aaron Reynolds took 4 minutes to connect and 12 seconds to change the direction of everything. Estes made the call from the hallway. When he came back in, he stood in the doorway for a moment before walking to Cole's side and saying quietly enough that it didn't carry, "He's on his way." He said, and I'm quoting him exactly, sir, "Don't touch anything." Cole looked at Estes. Those were his words. "Yes, sir." Cole looked at Jade Hartwell. She had not moved. She was watching Ghost, whose breathing had deepened into the long, slow rhythm of an animal in a rare state of complete rest, the kind of rest that required a particular kind of safety to produce. Flynn Estes drifted back toward Cole, dropping his voice further. "Sir, I had a second thought on the press theory." His earlier confidence had drained from the idea completely. A journalist doesn't have a level 6 locked file. A journalist doesn't know the name of a classified operation from 2019. And a journalist, he looked at the protective formation, the seated dogs, the way each one of the 14 was oriented, even at rest, around the axis of the woman in the maintenance uniform. "A journalist doesn't have this?" Cole said nothing. Ronan Briggs, who had been standing near the door in the patient posture of a man waiting for his instructions to become clear again, was doing his own reassessing. He had been replaying the moment in the hallway, not the physical fact of it, but what it had told him. He was a judo practitioner. He understood body language as information. The movement she'd made when he reached for her elbow was not a self-defense response. It was earlier than that. It was the response of someone who read contact before it arrived. Not a reaction, but an anticipation. The movement was so embedded in her that she appeared not to have noticed making it. He had seen that once before. In Fallujah in 2015, on a briefing room visit with a naval liaison, whose rank was listed simply as classified, the liaison had been a woman, small, quiet, had moved through that room like someone who was continuously aware of every angle in it. Briggs looked at Jade Hartwell. He looked at the forearm. The IED scarring was the specific constellation pattern that came from a very particular kind of proximity event. Not a roadside detonation, not an aerial strike. The close-in fragmentation that resulted from direct action entry in confined urban spaces when the charge was on the other side of a wall and someone went through anyway. He looked away. He straightened slightly, his posture adjusting without him consciously directing it. The reflexive military bearing of a body responding to a reclassification it hadn't formally received yet. Dr. Dahlia Morton, base veterinarian, had been peripheral to the morning's events. She'd come in at 0700 for her scheduled rounds and found herself standing at the edge of a situation that had its own gravity by then. She was 41, pragmatic, more comfortable with animals than with the particular variety of human conflict playing out in front of her. But she was also the person who knew these 14 dogs better than anyone on the medical side, and she had been watching the morning with the careful attention of someone whose specialty gave her a distinct way of reading what was happening. She crossed to her workstation quietly. She had an override access card for the base veterinary database, her level 4 clearance, standard for medical staff. She entered Delta's chip number, classified, clearance required. She'd expected this. She had heard Greer's exchange with Cole, but she tried Ranger's number anyway. Classified, clearance required. She sat back and looked at her screen. Then she looked across the room at the woman sitting against the wall with Ghost asleep on her knee. She took out her own access card, a secondary one issued 3 years ago by the base medical command that she had never had occasion to use. She entered the override code. She entered Ghost's number. The screen loaded, then it stopped, and displayed a single line that was different from the others. File sealed, pending authorization. Contact issuing authority. At the bottom of the screen, where the issuing authority field should have listed a standard database administrator, it listed a name, a rank, a designation she had only seen once before, in a brief she'd received when the K9 program was first established at Bravo. She looked at the name for a long time. Then she looked at Jade Hartwell. Then she looked at Cole, who was standing in the middle of the room, running the calculation she suspected he had been running since the moment the dogs formed that circle. and who was about 3 pieces of information away from the answer. She stood up. She crossed the room. She stood in front of Cole and said, quietly and precisely, "Commander, I need you to look at something." He followed her to the terminal. He read the screen. He read the name in the issuing authority field. The room continued around them. Estes typing, Brennan on the phone again, Briggs near the door, Vega in the corner, Willow Shaw looking at her phone with an expression that had gone very still. 14 dogs in various states of post-feeding rest, arranged in the unconscious geometry of animals that had decided where they were safest. Cole straightened from the terminal. He looked at Jade Hartwell for the 3rd time that morning, and it was different from the first 2 times. The first time he'd looked at a maintenance worker who shouldn't be there. The second time he'd looked at a civilian who knew too much. This time he was looking at something that hadn't resolved yet, something at the edge of a recognition he was not prepared for, something that the part of his brain that never stood down had been circling since 0600 hours and was now circling from a very different altitude. She met his gaze across the room, did not look away. He said, "Hartwell, I need to ask you something directly." "All right," she said. "Operation Phantom Storm, the gap in the wall. There was a handler." He kept his voice very careful. "A handler who cleared that entry point ahead of the unit, who positioned Delta on the east side and held the perimeter for 11 minutes while the team extracted." He paused. "That handler's name is not in any document I have ever been able to access. Not one." He stopped. "I have been trying to find that name for 4 years." The room was completely quiet. Ghost shifted his head on her knee. She did not look down. She looked at Cole. "Commander," she said, with the same mild tone she'd used all morning, the tone of someone for whom this conversation was long overdue, not urgent. "With respect, you've been looking in the wrong places." And across the room, Willow Shaw looked up from her phone. On her screen was a congressional database record, a single line buried in an appropriations footnote from 4 years ago. A Navy Cross citation, recipient listed as Master Chief Petty Officer J. Hartwell. Details, classified in full. Shaw looked at the woman against the wall. She looked at the 14 dogs. She looked at Cole, who was 3 seconds from understanding what she had just understood. The morning was about to break open in a completely different direction. And the woman in the maintenance uniform, who had arrived before dawn, who had fed 14 animals no one else could calm, who had sat quietly through an hour of being told she didn't belong here, was still sitting against the wall, waiting. The way someone waits who already knows how this ends. Willow Shaw stared at her phone screen for 4 seconds. Then she looked up at Jade Hartwell, the maintenance uniform, the low ponytail, the left forearm resting across her knee with its old silver-white scarring catching the fluorescent light, and something slid into place behind her eyes with the quiet, irreversible click of understanding that had been building for 3 weeks without anyone noticing. Master Chief Petty Officer J. Hartwell. Navy Cross citation. 4 years old. Details, classified in full. No photograph, no unit designation visible, just a name, a rank, and the deliberate shape of an absence. The kind left by someone who wanted a record to exist, but not to be read. Shaw set her clipboard on the nearest surface, face down, and did not pick it up again. Across the room, Cole was still at Dahlia Morton's workstation, the terminal screen reflected in his eyes. Morton stood at his shoulder, saying nothing because she had said the necessary thing, and now it was his to work with. The name in the issuing authority field, the rank, the classification chain that led, if followed far enough, to a place the base personnel command did not officially acknowledge. Cole turned from the screen. He looked at Jade Hartwell, and it was different from the first 2 times he had looked at her this morning. The first time, a maintenance worker who shouldn't be there. The second, a civilian who knew too much. This time, he was standing at the edge of a recognition he was not prepared for, the part of his brain that never stood down circling something from a very different altitude. Hartwell. He kept his voice even. "I want to ask you something directly." She waited. "Operation Phantom Storm." The name sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. The handler who positioned Delta on the east wall and held the perimeter during extraction. I've been trying to find that name for 4 years. My own after-action report has a gap in it. I was told the information wasn't available to me. He stopped. I've been in naval special warfare for 16 years, Nobody has ever told me an operational detail wasn't available to me. The room was completely still. Ghost had not moved from her knee. Delta sat 2 feet from her left side. Ranger, in the far corner, had turned fully to face across the room, with the alert focus of an animal, tracking something that mattered. Cole took 1 step forward. The handler's position in the mission file is listed as Element Phantom. He looked at the way Delta was sitting, at Ghost pressed against her hip, at the 14 animals distributed throughout the room, not random, not restless, but positioned with the unconscious exactness of animals that had been trained to hold a perimeter and had simply never stopped. He looked at the number Morton had shown him in the issuing authority field. He looked at Jade Hartwell's left shoulder. The maintenance shirt had a tear at the shoulder seam, small from Brennan's contact earlier, not visible unless you were close and looking. He was looking. Beneath the tear, against the base of her left shoulder, was the edge of something, old ink, a color that time had blurred from black to the deep blue-gray of water at depth, a line, the suggestion of a shape. "Hartwell," Cole said very quietly. "What's on your shoulder?" The air in the room did not move. Jade looked at him, at the question, at what was behind it. Not the authority of a commander, but something that had been building since 0600 and had arrived. Finally, at the only place it could arrive. She did not answer. Brennan stepped forward. Her morning had been a sequence of escalating disruptions, and she had run out of patience for its ambiguity. She moved to Jade's side and reached for the shoulder of the maintenance shirt. "This ends now." Her voice was clipped, efficient. "We are establishing your identity. We are completing this review, and this program evaluation proceeds on schedule." She gripped the fabric, pulled. The shirt was old. The shoulder seam had been weakened earlier. The fabric separated along the full length of the left arm, the worn cotton giving up the fight it had been losing since before any of them arrived, and the sleeve came away. The room stopped, not figuratively. Every body in K9 Bravo stopped moving at the same instant, as if time had been briefly suspended at the moment of maximum information. Jade Hartwell's left arm was bare to the shoulder. The IED scarring that Shaw had glimpsed at the forearm ran further than anyone had seen, not covering, not disfiguring, but marking the arm from wrist to mid-bicep in the fragmented constellation of close-in blast exposure. The specific pattern that came from a person being on the wrong side of a barrier when a charge detonated, and coming back anyway. Old wounds, fully healed. The body's record of what it had survived and kept moving through. And on the left shoulder, fully exposed now, no longer edged or suggested, the tattoo, an eagle's skull in profile. Beneath it, a beret. Beneath that, a single numerical designation in block figures, 721. And beside the number, one letter, P, the letter that Caleb Vega recognized first. He recognized it because he had been in a briefing room in 2019 when a senior SEAL officer had mentioned it in passing, in the context of an action that had not been officially recorded and would not be discussed. He'd been told afterward that the letter didn't mean anything, that he'd misheard. He had not misheard. "Phantom," Vega said. He said it the way you say something when you're confirming something you had already, on some cellular level, known. Brennan's hand was still on the torn sleeve. She released it. 3 seconds of silence, the kind that isn't absence but presence, a room full of people experiencing the same information arriving at different speeds, each at the exact moment their individual understanding could accommodate it. Carter Greer looked at the tattoo, looked at his database screen, showing 14 sealed files, looked at the behavioral anomaly reports he'd been writing for 3 weeks about animals that would not respond to any handler, any protocol, any clinical intervention. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Flynn Estes stood with his tablet at his side. The press theory was gone. The administrative anomaly theory was gone. The entire framework he'd been constructing all morning had dissolved, and in its place was a fact so simple and complete he couldn't understand why he hadn't arrived at it 90 minutes ago. There was one person in the world who could walk into a room with these 14 animals and have them form a protective perimeter the moment someone touched her. That was not a journalist. Ronan Briggs straightened. It happened automatically, the way breathing happens. the body's structural response to a signal the conscious mind had barely processed. Spine vertical, shoulders squared, heels together, the posture of a soldier in the presence of someone whose rank and service history demanded it. He had not decided to do it. His training had. Willow Shaw had her hand over her mouth. Not dramatically, just the small, contained gesture of someone who has been trying to say something for 20 minutes and has just been told, definitively, that she was right to wait. Iris Brennan looked at the tattoo for a long time. Then she looked at her own hand, still holding the torn sleeve. She set it down on the nearest surface. She took 2 steps backward. Her composure was intact, but it was the composure of a person holding something carefully, because they understood that putting it down too fast would cause damage. Delta moved. He crossed the floor in a single fluid motion and sat flush against Jade's left leg, not facing outward in the defensive orientation he'd held all morning, but simply present, his shoulder against her knee. The 12 kenneled dogs went from their low, persistent alertness to a settled, complete quiet. The kind of quiet a room full of working animals produces when they have registered that the threat has resolved and the person who mattered was still there. Jade Hartwell had not moved. She was sitting against the wall with her arm bare and her tattoo visible, and 14 animals arranged around her in the geometry of animals that had come home. And her expression was exactly what it had been at 0600 when she was spooning food into bowls, present, quiet, unsurprised. Cole looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had undergone a complete transformation. Stripped of the command register he'd used as a tool all morning, carrying instead the precise quality of a senior officer who has arrived at the far side of a significant error and is choosing how to carry what he found there. Master Chief Petty Officer Jade Hartwell. He said the full designation clearly, without inflection, with the simple respect of someone saying a thing correctly for the first time. Element Phantom, SEAL Team 7. She said nothing. Kandahar, 2019. Phantom Storm. His throat moved once. You positioned Delta on the east wall at 2200 hours. You held the perimeter while my team extracted. When we cleared the compound, the handler was gone. He stopped. I wrote in my after-action that the position had been held by an unknown special operations element, because I was never given a name. He looked at her steadily. That was 4 years ago. Jade Hartwell looked at Ethan Cole for a long moment. 19 minutes, she said. He blinked. You were down for 19 minutes, not 11. The mildness in her voice held the weight of someone correcting a record that had bothered them for a long time. Delta held the east wall. I held the north entry. Your team was in that compound for 19 minutes. I know, because I was counting. Cole absorbed this. His jaw was tight. Something complicated was happening behind his eyes. We were told the compound was clear when we entered. It wasn't, she said. That's why we were there first. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a person learns that someone held a line for them for 19 minutes in the dark and never asked to be acknowledged for it. Vega's hand had gone to his chest. Ranger pressed upward against him. Shaw had stopped trying to manage her expression. And Ethan Cole, Commander, Naval Special Warfare, 16 years of service, a man trained to regard the display of feeling as a liability, did something nobody in the room anticipated. He said, I'm sorry. He said it simply, without architecture around it. The apology of someone who understood precisely what they were apologizing for. For this morning, he said. For not, he stopped, recalibrated. You were here before I arrived. You've been here at 0300 every day for 3 weeks. And I walked in and told you to leave. Jade Hartwell looked at him. You didn't know. That's not sufficient, he said. No, she agreed, but it's accurate. The door opened. Colonel Aaron Reynolds did not announce himself. He walked through the door of K9 Bravo at 0822 with the energy of a man who had been moving fast since a phone call, and who had been waiting for a phone call like this one for considerably longer than this morning. He was 57, silver at the temples. The build of a man who had been fit for 30 years and never stopped. His eyes swept the room, left wall, right wall, center, down, and then found Jade Hartwell, and he stopped moving. Room, attention. His voice was not loud. It carried anyway. Every person in K9 Bravo came to attention automatically. Briggs, who had already straightened. Estes, tablet under his arm before he'd consciously decided to move it. Greer, who had the expression of someone who had just understood the full scope of the last 2 hours. Brennan, whose professional composure had been operating at significant cost since the sleeve came away. Reynolds looked at the room, took in the tableau, the torn sleeve on the counter, the visible tattoo, the 14 dogs in their settled configuration around Jade Hartwell, the specific quality of stillness that only happens when something that has been wrong for a long time has been made right. He looked at Cole. "Have you arrived at the picture?" "Most of it, sir. Most of it." Reynolds moved to the center of the room. He looked at Jade Hartwell without the uncertainty or authority performance that the morning had produced in everyone else. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they know. "Jade." "Sir," she said, "you've been here 3 weeks." "Yes, sir." "You didn't tell anyone you were coming." "No, sir." A small pause. "You could have called me." "I could have," she agreed. Reynolds held her gaze for another moment. The compressed communication of a commanding officer and a person he had known for a long time, exchanging everything that needed exchanging without requiring more words. Then he turned to face the room. "This facility," Reynolds said, and his voice had the quality of someone reading into a permanent record, "operates under a classified mandate that most of you do not have clearance to review in full. The animals in this building are veterans of Joint Special Operations actions in 3 theaters across 8 years of active service. Their handler of record, across every single deployment, is Master Chief Petty Officer Jade Hartwell, SEAL Team 7, Element Phantom, 14 years of active service." He paused. "Element Phantom has no public record. Master Chief Hartwell's service file is sealed at Level 6 clearance. She is standing in this room because these animals have been in documented psychological distress since her separation from service. Or service 2 years ago. And she, without any institutional support, without authorization, without compensation, has been coming here at 0300 hours every morning for 3 weeks because she was the only intervention that would work." The room absorbed this. "The budget evaluation scheduled for this morning," Reynolds continued, and his voice sharpened, "including the proposal to discontinue this program, is suspended indefinitely." He looked at Cole, then at Brennan. "If that proposal is formally submitted, it will be returned unsigned. That is not a negotiation." He looked at Estes. "The volunteer intake form that admitted Master Chief Hartwell will be replaced with a formal consultant credential as of 0900 today." He looked at Greer. "Your behavioral assessments will be revised to reflect a handler imprinting phenomenon that requires a separate research document, which Dr. Morton will lead." He looked at Morton. Morton nodded with the expression of someone who'd suspected something significant for 3 weeks and was now being confirmed correct. Reynolds turned finally back to Jade Hartwell. "There's an offer in a sealed envelope going to your P.O. box today," he said. "I need an answer by Friday." She looked at him. "What's the offer?" "Program consultant, 14 animals. 0300 hours, if that's when you work best, with full credentials this time." A pause. "You'd have to sign paperwork." Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, but its immediate precursor. "I'll read the envelope." Reynolds nodded once, then he turned back to Cole. What happened next was not theatrical. It did not have the quality of performance. It had the quality of something earned through error, and the willingness to acknowledge the error without shelter around it. Ethan Cole rotated to face Jade Hartwell. His right hand came up, deliberate, unhurried, the full formal salute of a naval officer who understood what the gesture meant and was rendering it in full, not the abbreviated version of a busy corridor. The kind of salute that said something specific about what the person rendering it had understood and was now prepared to carry. He held it. The room held its breath. Jade Hartwell looked at him, at the salute, at the 4 years behind it, at the 19 minutes in Kandahar and the gap in the after-action and the morning's entire weight compressed into this single gesture from a man who had walked in ready to have her removed and was now standing straight in front of her with his hand raised. She raised her hand. Clean, precise. The return salute of a Master Chief Petty Officer with 14 years of active service, which was not diminished by the torn maintenance shirt or the bare arm or anything else about the morning's circumstances. "Commander," she said. "Master Chief," he said. Both hands came down. Cole exhaled through his nose, the specific exhale of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just put it down in the right place. Across the room, Caleb Vega started to applaud, not a signal to anyone else. Just one hand against his own thigh, slow, deliberate, the applause of a man who understood better than most what it cost to hold a line for 19 minutes for people who didn't know you were there. Nobody else clapped. The room didn't require it. Before we get to what Colonel Reynolds said that made everyone in this room go completely still, make sure you've subscribed and shared this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because the next 60 seconds of this story are going to hit hard. This is what real service looks like. Stay with us. The next hour moved differently from the first. Brennan took her folder of budget documentation from the counter near the door and handed it to her administrative assistant without comment. Before she left, she looked once at Jade Hartwell, at the tattoo, at the dogs, at the conclusion of the salute, and she said, "Master Chief, I didn't have the complete picture." Jade looked at her. "Very few people do," she said. "That's by design." Brennan stood with that for a moment. Then she nodded, once controlled, and walked out. It was the most honest thing she had said all morning, and she had said it almost entirely in the pause before it. Flynn Estes approached Cole when the room had shifted from confrontation to aftermath. "Sir, the press theory." "Gone," Cole said. "Yes, sir." Estes looked at the back of his phone screen. "I was working with available information." "We all were." Cole watched Jade Hartwell across the room, crouched beside Delta now, hand at the level of the dog's jaw, not touching, just present, making space for something to come to her. Delta pressed his nose into her palm. She knew, before she walked in, what this morning was going to look like. She came anyway. Estes looked at the 14 animals in their settled quiet. Why? Cole watched Delta's eyes close briefly under the contact, watched Ghost circle back and press against her knee. "Because they needed her to," he said. "That's the only reason she requires." Estes absorbed this. It was not the kind of answer that fit a cost-benefit analysis. He looked at the revised program recommendation he was going to draft, the one reclassifying K9 Bravo from discretionary to essential with a 40% funding increase, and understood for the first time that it wasn't a recommendation. It was a correction. He opened his tablet and started writing. Carter Greer had been at his terminal for 15 minutes, not searching anything, just sitting with his screen open and his hands in his lap. Dahlia Morton passed behind him on her way back from the kennel row, and he said without turning, "Every anomaly I logged, 3 weeks of observations. I was attributing them to standard post-deployment adjustment disorder, handler separation anxiety, manageable with routine and environmental consistency." Morton stopped. "Yes. None of my interventions worked because they were all built on the assumption that the handler was permanently gone." He looked at his reports. "She was here from week 1. The animals knew immediately. Everything I prescribed was insufficient." Morton sat down on the spare stool beside him. "Your assessments weren't wrong," she said. "They were based on incomplete information, deliberately incomplete. That's not your error." She looked at his documentation. 3 weeks of careful, precise observation by someone doing their professional best with a compromised data set. What you have right now is the most detailed behavioral record of handler imprinting recovery in a multi-animal JSOC cohort that has ever been documented. Because no such record existed before this, she paused. "I'm going to need all of it, including the anomaly notes you set aside." Greer turned to look at her. "Handler imprinting in special operations working dogs," Morton said. 14 subjects, 3-week recovery timeline, documented progression from acute distress to full reorientation. She looked at the row of kennels. "You were here paying attention. That's what produced this data." A beat. "The Journal of Military Animal Behavioral Science is going to want the winter issue submission by November." Greer turned back to his screen. After a moment, he opened his files and began organizing 3 weeks of observations with the focused energy of a professional who has found what his competence was actually for. Ronan Briggs found Jade Hartwell at the kennel row near the end of the building, running a check on the automated water dispensers. Maintenance no one had asked her to do that she had noticed needed doing. He waited until she looked up. "Ma'am?" Direct, no preamble. "This morning, when I approached you initially, Sergeant Briggs, I want to say clearly that I was operating on a signed protocol without sufficient situational awareness. That's not an excuse." She regarded him with the evaluating steadiness that had unnerved every person who encountered it this morning. "You handled the secondary approach correctly," she said. "When the dogs responded, you stopped." He had not expected that. "A lot of people don't stop," she said. "You read the room. That matters." Briggs stood with this. Then he nodded, a single contained motion carrying more acknowledgement than several sentences would have. He turned to go. Briggs, he turned back. She was looking at his hands, specifically at the structural callousing of the outer palm. 8 years, right? He blinked. Judo. Yes, ma'am. Good foundation, she said, and turned back to the water dispenser. Keep going with it. He stood in the space of that for a moment. Then he went. At 9:15, Willow Shaw was making coffee in the small break room when footsteps sounded in the corridor and Jade Hartwell appeared in the doorway. Shaw held up the coffee pot. An offer. Jade took a mug from the shelf and held it out. The break room was small enough that two people standing in it occupied the same conversation whether they intended to or not. A folding table, 2 chairs, a corkboard with shift schedules pinned to it, a window that looked out onto the side alley between K9 Bravo and the adjacent storage facility. Somebody had taped a photograph to the corner of the corkboard. A Malinois in full working kit, sitting at the heel position of someone whose lower half was visible, but whose face was out of frame. Shaw had been looking at that photograph for 8 months without knowing whose dog it was or where the picture had been taken. She had a feeling she knew now. You found something on your phone, Jade said, not a question. Congressional database, appropriations footnote, Navy Cross citation. Shaw looked down at her mug. Your name is in it. I know. Did you put it there so it could be found? Jade considered this for a moment. Someone put it there, she said. I didn't stop them. Shaw turned her mug in both hands. The intake form I processed 3 weeks ago. You wrote 4 words in the volunteer reason box. I remember. I know these dogs. Shaw looked up. That was the whole explanation. It was the whole truth. Shaw was quiet. You knew this morning was coming, that someone would eventually walk in and challenge your presence. Programs like this get reviewed. Budgets get reviewed. Someone comes in, sees a woman in a maintenance uniform, draws conclusions. A pause. It was going to happen. And you came anyway. I came anyway. Shaw set her mug down. She looked through the small window into the kennel facility, where Delta was doing the long, loose-shouldered lope of an animal that had released something it had been holding. Ranger hadn't eaten properly in 4 days before you arrived. I saw it in the logs. Nothing in the protocol. Nothing in the protocol covers this, Jade said. That's not the protocol's fault. It wasn't built for what these animals experienced. What did they experience? Jade looked at the steam rising from her coffee, at something on the other side of the question that she was deciding whether to walk toward. They worked in some of the hardest environments we put animals into, she said. Not just combat. The specific kind of sustained close-quarters action where they were the difference between a team extracting and a team not extracting. Night after night, year after year. She paused. And then the work ended, and I had to leave, and they were just here, in kennels, with handlers who were following every protocol correctly and not being the person they needed. Shaw listened. Animals that work at that level form a primary orientation, not just bonding, orientation. I was their reference point for 6 years. When I left, they didn't become untethered. They became displaced, waiting. She looked through the window at Delta. I don't think they stopped working. I think they were waiting to work again. And then you came back, Shaw said, 3 weeks ago. And Ranger ate. Shaw paused. And Ghost slept. Day 2 for Ranger, day 4 for Ghost. A pause. Delta was last. Day 9. Shaw was quiet for a moment. What happened to your shoulder? She said. Then immediately, you don't have to answer that. Immediate structural entry. Helmand, 2018. The answer came without weight. The tone of someone who had decided their history was a fact about themselves, not a wound to manage. We were clearing a building. Charge on the interior of the door frame. I went through before the sweep was complete. Why? Jade looked at Delta through the window. Because Ghost was on my 6 and the alternative was worse. Shaw looked at her. You went through a rigged doorway to protect a dog. Ghost had made 4 successful entries that night. He'd located 3 pieces of ordnance the sweep missed. He'd kept 6 people alive. She looked at Shaw. You tell me what the math is. Shaw held this. She looked at the room full of animals resting in their recovered quiet. She looked at the woman who had arrived before dawn with no authorization and a torn maintenance shirt and had been the only thing standing between 14 working dogs and a budget review that would have ended them. She looked at the photograph pinned to the corkboard. The Malinois in working kit, the heel position, the lower half of a person whose face was out of frame. Is that Delta? She asked. Jade looked at the photograph. A small pause. the briefest softening of something that had been very controlled all morning. Kandahar, 2017, his first deployment. Another pause. He was afraid of helicopters. Took us 6 weeks to work through it. Shaw looked at the photograph, at the dog's posture, the specific combination of alertness and ease that came from an animal doing the thing it was built for, alongside the person it trusted. Who took it? Rivera, Jade said. Ghost's handler. He documented everything, said somebody should. She looked at the photograph for a moment. He was right. Shaw turned her mug in her hands. Then she said, "The note at the bottom of Ghost's file." Shaw looked at her sharply. "You haven't found it yet. Morton will. I wrote it before my discharge." She looked at her coffee. "I wrote it because I wanted whoever came after me to understand something." "What did it say?" A pause. "If you're reading this, they're not just dogs. Don't let anyone forget that." Shaw held those words. "Nobody has," she said quietly. "You and Vega. You were both here." Jade looked at her. "You were here," she said. "You're the one who noticed Ranger wasn't eating. You kept the logs. You processed the intake form without pushing for information you didn't need." She set down her mug. "That matters, Corporal. Don't minimize it." Shaw didn't have an answer for that. She didn't need one. At 0950, Cole found Reynolds in the corridor. Reynolds ended his call and looked at Cole with the patience of a man who had expected this conversation. "Phantom Storm," Cole said. "You knew." "Yes." "You knew who held the perimeter." "Yes, for 4 years. For 4 years, the information was classified in a way that prevented disclosure to the operational personnel involved. You know how that works." "I know how it works." Cole kept his voice level. "I also spent 4 years carrying a gap in my after-action, with a gap in my understanding of an operation that cost us a man. And the person who held that perimeter for 19 minutes was here, in this building, for 3 weeks. And I walked in and told her to leave." Reynolds looked at him steadily. "Is that something you can carry?" "I already said what I needed to say." "To her? To her?" Reynolds nodded slowly. "Then the rest is process." He looked through the window at K9 Bravo. "She's going to say yes to the offer, by Friday, possibly sooner." Cole watched Jade Hartwell through the window, back at the kennel row, checking water levels, doing the unhurried work of tending to each animal, her hand moving briefly along each kennel mesh in the gesture of someone saying, "I'm here," in a language that needed no translation. "She already said yes," he said. "She said it 3 weeks ago. The paperwork just needs to catch up." Reynolds studied his officer for a moment, then, "Write the supplement to Phantom Storm. Fill the gap. It doesn't need to be public. It needs to be accurate." "Yes, sir," Cole said. He said it the way he said things when he meant them, without reservation. The afternoon settled into something quieter than the morning deserved. By 1300 hours, the revised program recommendation had been drafted, signed, and submitted. K9 Bravo reclassified from discretionary to essential. Funding increased by 40%, effective immediately. Estes drafted it himself. It did not require direction. Greer's 3 weeks of behavioral assessments were in Morton's research partition by 11:30, complete with his anomaly notes, the observations that hadn't fit his diagnostic framework and had been set aside. Morton read through them and found, embedded in what Greer had dismissed as inconclusive data, the most precise record of handler imprinting recovery progression in a multi-animal special operations cohort she had ever encountered. She called the Journal of Military Animal Behavioral Science at 1400 hours and asked about winter issue availability without explaining what she had. They said yes. At 1500, Caleb Vega was in his corner with Ranger when Jade Hartwell came and sat nearby. Not beside him, not asking anything of him, just settling into the adjacent space with the complete absence of performance that some people mistake for indifference, and which was, in fact, its opposite. Ranger put his head in her lap. Vega watched this. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The afternoon light had shifted to the low amber quality of late day, coming through the high ventilation windows at an angle that turned the concrete floor the color of old wood. Outside, somewhere on the base, a detail was running a drill, the faint rhythmic percussion of boots on pavement. Inside K9 Bravo, the only sounds were the breathing of 14 animals and the quiet that had settled over the room like something earned. "You trained him," Vega said finally, "from 11 months. Behavioral assessment said he probably wasn't going to make operational threshold." She set her hand on Ranger's back. "He made Helmand, 4 deployments before that. When he came back without Rivera and without his Mosul handler, he shut down." But Vega looked at the dog. 8 months of work with him. The progress has been incremental on good days. Some weeks I thought we were getting somewhere. Then a door would slam in the corridor, and he'd go back to the beginning. He paused. I didn't understand what I was working against. He was waiting for something to make sense again, she said. The shutdown isn't damage, it's orientation. He's very oriented. It's one of the things that made him exceptional in the field, that complete, unwavering sense of where his axis was. She looked at Ranger. When the axis disappeared, he didn't fall apart. He stopped. He was waiting for it to come back. Vega absorbed this. The distinction between falling apart and waiting, the difference between damage and loyalty, sat in the room between them for a moment. Is that what you tell yourself? He said quietly. About what happened to you? She looked at her left arm, at the old scarring. The discharge was medical. Shoulder damage from Helmand plus accumulated impact across 14 years. The evaluation board was correct. A pause. What I told myself is that I'd been doing the work for 14 years, and it was time for it to change shape. And now the work is 0300 in a K9 facility. The work, she said, is exactly what it always was, making sure they have what they need. Vega's thumb moved in a slow stroke down Ranger's ear. Ranger exhaled, the long, settling breath of an animal at rest. I lost my leg in Helmand. 2021. IED under a vehicle. He looked at the prosthetic left leg. First 6 months after discharge, I did everything by the numbers. Attended the groups, completed the assessments, followed the program. Clinically, I was progressing. He paused. I wasn't progressing. What changed? They put me in with Ranger. He looked at the dog. First session, he spent 45 minutes in the opposite corner of the room, not looking at me. Second session, the same. Third session, he walked halfway across the room, sat down, and stared at me for 20 minutes, like I was a problem he was trying to solve. A pause. Fourth session, he put his head on my knee. I don't know who moved first. I don't think either of us decided to. He shook his head slowly. I came to this program for the statistics. Therapy success rate for combat veterans with mobility injuries. I came for the numbers. And stayed for the dog, Jade said. Ranger started eating again 3 weeks ago, Vega said. Day 2 after you arrived. I checked the feeding log. He looked at her steadily. The coordinator told me it was probably the environmental routine finally establishing. I didn't correct her. Jade said nothing. Animals know before people do, he said. Usually, she said. He shook his head. Always. At 1600, Willow Shaw knocked on Morton's office door and asked if she could see the note at the bottom of Ghost's file. Morton pulled it up and turned the screen. If you're reading this, they're not just dogs. Don't let anyone forget that. Shaw read it twice. Then she sat down in the spare chair and read it a third time, not because she didn't understand it, but because it was the kind of sentence that deserved more than one pass. She knew someone would find it, she said. She wrote it the day before her discharge, Morton said. Scanned it in herself at the issuing authority level because she was the issuing authority. She looked at the note on the screen. She's been planning to come back for 2 years. She waited until the program was at risk, Shaw said, until she was the only intervention that would work. The timing of her arrival, 3 weeks before the scheduled budget evaluation, is not coincidental. Morton looked at Shaw. She's very methodical. She knew the review was coming. She knew her presence, unexplained, would create its own kind of pressure. She knew this morning was going to happen the way it happened. A long pause. She came anyway. 14 days of 0300 hours before anyone with authority noticed she was here. Shaw thought about that. And by the time they noticed, the dogs had already decided, Morton said, which meant the argument was already over. She just had to wait for the humans to catch up. Shaw thought of 0300 hours. The lights off. The concrete floor. 14 dogs quiet in the dark and one woman sitting in the middle of it without asking for anything in return. She's been doing this her whole career, Shaw said. Showing up without being asked. Holding lines without anyone knowing she was there. And leaving before anyone could acknowledge it, Morton said. Until today, Shaw said. Morton closed the file carefully. The way you close something that deserves to be handled with attention. She held Shaw's gaze. Until today. At 1700, K9 Bravo was officially closed to non-essential personnel. Jade Hartwell was inside it. She hadn't been asked to stay. She hadn't volunteered. She had simply continued through the afternoon's transitions and the late light from the high ventilation windows, doing what she had been doing for 3 weeks. being present with the animals in the unhurried way that communicated, at a frequency no database or behavioral report could fully document, that the reference point had returned and would not leave again. The overhead lights were off. A single floor lamp near Vega's corner threw a warm pool of light across the concrete. Ghost was sprawled on his side, in the total magnificent bonelessness of a dog that had decided it was safe to stop being on alert. Delta moved in the exercise area in the slow patrol circuit that was his version of unwinding. The remaining 12 were in various configurations of rest, some pressed against the kennel mesh toward the center of the room, all of them quieter than they'd been in months. Jade was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, legs extended, the envelope from Reynolds in her hand, retrieved from the base admin officer at 1730, held through the last hour without opening. Not resistance, something more like giving herself space to sit with the weight of it before deciding, because some decisions deserved that. She looked at it. She thought about 0300 hours 3 weeks ago, walking in here in the dark and hearing 14 dogs register her presence and go one by one, from the specific restless half-sleep of animals in sustained distress into something else. Not silence, a different quality of breathing. The exhale of a room that had been holding itself for a long time and had just been given permission to let go. She thought about Delta on the east wall at 2200 hours in Kandahar, about the 19 minutes, about the gap in Cole's after-action that he'd been carrying for 4 years, and the salute that had followed the understanding of it. She thought about what Reynolds would have written at the bottom of the offer document. She didn't need to open the envelope to know the shape of what was inside it. The door opened. She did not look up immediately. She heard the footsteps, 2 sets, close together, and registered the quality of movement before the identities. Controlled, deliberate, people who were not here by accident. She looked up. Ethan Cole stood in the doorway. Behind him, slightly to his left, was a face she had not seen since before her discharge. A face from a briefing room, from a mission debrief, from the specific grief of a record that had said separation when it should have said medical hold. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Rivera, Ghost's handler, living, standing, apparently whole, in the doorway of K9 Bravo at 1815 on a Thursday in North Carolina. Jade looked at him. Then she looked at Ghost, who had stopped sleeping. Ghost lifted his head. His ears came forward. His entire body reorganized itself. The specific, whole animal recognition of a dog registering a presence it had given up the right to expect. Not excitement. Something older. The particular knowing of a dog who had been carrying an absence and found it suddenly filled. She looked at Cole. Cole looked at her with the expression of a man who had made 2 phone calls in the last 3 hours and was carrying the results of both. Rivera was medevaced from Mosul at a non-standard facility, he said. The service record indicated separation. It should have indicated medical hold. He's been trying to find out where Ghost was for 2 years. Rivera was already looking at Ghost with an expression that did not translate into words. Ghost stood up. He crossed the room. Jade moved her hand from where it had rested on Ghost's back and let him go. She watched the reunion, the intensity of it, the completeness, the way Ghost pressed into Rivera's hands as if reestablishing a contact point that had been interrupted rather than severed, as if 2 years had simply been a long wait, and the wait was now over. Rivera was speaking to Ghost in a low, private voice, his face lowered, his hands on the dog's head. The specific frequency of a person talking to the one creature in the world that had been through what they'd been through. Cole looked at Jade. She was watching Ghost and Rivera with an expression that held a great deal without showing any of it. "I made some calls this afternoon," Cole said. "I see that." Rivera was at Walter Reed, administrative separation error. Nobody connected him to Ghost because the file was sealed. A pause. "I connected him to Ghost." She looked at Cole, at what he was offering with that statement. Not an apology. They had already done the apology, but the specific answer to what a person does after they understand they've been wrong. They act. "How many more?" she said. Cole's expression moved. "That's what I asked Reynolds this afternoon. Other files at the same level as yours, other handlers, other gaps that didn't close the right way." He looked at Rivera and Ghost. He said the scope of the consultant role is broader than the document describes. She looked at the envelope in her hand. She understood what that meant. The work she'd thought had changed shape had not, in fact, finished with her. What was changing was not the work, but the form it would take. No longer 300 hours in the dark, no longer a maintenance uniform and a volunteer intake form and a P.O. box address. Something formalized, something that would let her do what she'd been doing, but further, and for more than 14 animals. She stood up. She crossed the room to Cole and held the envelope out to him. He looked at it. "Give that back to Reynolds," she said. "Tell him I need the credential active by Monday, and I need access to the sealed files." She paused. "All of them." Cole took the envelope. "Monday," he said. "I work better with a deadline." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but its immediate precursor. "Yes, Master Chief." She looked at him for a moment. The version of Ethan Cole that existed on the other side of this morning, which was a different version from the one who had walked through the door at 0600. "Cole," he looked at her, "the gap in your after-action." He went still. "Write the supplement, 19 minutes, East Wall and North Entry, Kandahar, 2019. You have everything you need now." "Yes," he said, "I do." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and walked back to the wall and sat down. Delta came and settled beside her. Ranger, who had followed Vega in at some point in the last hour and was lying in his usual corner, lifted his head and pressed it into her lap again. The weight of an animal that had made its decision about where its axis was and had no interest in revising it. Across the room, Rivera was still talking to Ghost in the low, private voice of a person who has found what was lost. He stayed for 3 hours. When he finally rose to go, Sosata, Ghost walked with him to the door, stood at the kennel threshold, watched him go, then turned around, looked at Jade across the room, a long, steady look, and went to his bed and lay down and slept. The deep, uninterrupted sleep of an animal that has resolved something and can now rest completely. Cole set the envelope in his jacket pocket and looked at the room one last time. The 14 animals, the warm lamp, the woman against the wall, the specific piece of a space where a significant amount of force had moved through and settled, leaving something clean in its wake. He left without saying anything further. He didn't need to. The door closed. The base did what it did at the end of a long day. Shift changes, vehicles, the distant percussion of routine settling into evening. The budget review was suspended, the credentials were processing, the program was funded. 14 animals that did not officially exist in any public record were resting in a building they had learned over 3 weeks to understand as a place where the reference point came back. In 3 weeks, Caleb Vega would receive a modified therapy recommendation that included Ranger as a formal service companion, paperwork Jade had quietly flagged to Morton at 1400, which Morton had escalated to Reynolds, which had been approved in 40 minutes. In 6 weeks, Willow Shaw would begin coursework for a K9 behavioral specialist certification, funded by a grant that had not existed at 0600 this morning, and existed now because someone with the right knowledge had made the right call. Shaw would complete the certification 11 months later and be assigned as the primary behavioral coordinator for K9 Bravo, a position that would not have existed without the morning that had just passed. Ethan Cole, sitting in his car in the base parking structure at 1900 hours, would write the first paragraph of the Phantom Storm supplement in the notes application of his phone, because he had learned over 16 years that the first paragraph was the hardest, and that the right time to write it was the moment the words arrived, rather than the moment a desk became available. He would write, "At 2200 hours, on the night of the extraction, the perimeter on the east and north approaches to the compound was held by Master Chief Petty Officer Jade Hartwell, Element Phantom, SEAL Team 7. The duration of her hold was 19 minutes, not 11 as previously reported. The correction of this record is long overdue." He would stare at those sentences for a while. Then he would save them and drive home. In the winter issue of the Journal of Military Animal Behavioral Science, a paper would appear documenting the first fully recorded case of primary handler imprinting in a 14-subject JSOCK9 cohort, co-authored by Morton and Greer, acknowledged by an individual listed only as Master Chief J. Hartwell, consultant. The paper would be cited 47 times in its first year. It would change a protocol that had been unchanged for 11 years. None of this was visible in the evening quiet of K9 Bravo, but all of it had already begun. Jade Hartwell sat on the concrete floor with her back against the wall and her left arm bare, and the old scars silver in the low lamplight. Ghost asleep, Delta at her left, Ranger's chin on her knee. The others resting, breathing, doing the slow work of being safe. She looked at the 14 animals, at the strip of North Carolina sky, visible through the ventilation window, the particular dark blue of late evening, the color that comes just before the stars appear. She exhaled, the specific kind of exhale that comes after, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't perform relief, just releases the held breath of a very long day, the way a room releases the day's heat through the night, quietly, steadily, completely. 0300 tomorrow, she told Delta. His tail thumped once on the concrete. She looked up at the strip of sky. The stars were coming out. Nobody's taking you anywhere, she said. The voice of someone making an operational statement they intend to maintain indefinitely. Not on my watch. Ranger's tail moved in the dark. Ghost went on sleeping. The night settled over Fort Bragg in the way that nights settle over places where a great deal has been decided and the decisions have been made correctly. Without fanfare, without ceremony, with the simple weight of things that are finally right. The woman who had held a wall for 19 minutes in Kandahar without asking to be known for it. Who had walked through a rigged doorway in Helmand for a dog. Who had come back before dawn for 3 weeks with no authorization and a P.O. box address and 4 words written on a volunteer intake form. She sat with 14 animals who had been waiting for her and breathed with them in the quiet. The work was the work. It had always been the work. It would go on being the work. And that, for Jade Hartwell, was enough.